Tom Trikalinos. Tom directs the Evidence-Based Practice Center at Brown University, and he works is always very innovative methodologies around evidence synthesis. Take it away, Tom.
I decided to actually make some changes as I was realizing that we are getting short on time. And the stuff that I would like to discuss today are about evidence synthesis for decision analysis. There are no disclosures that I should like to make, and I should say that this work is in part supported by AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and their Evidence-Based Practice Center program. So in empirical disciplines like public health and medicine, many of us follow what we deem a reasonable principle, and that is the principle of total evidence. And what it says is that to increase the likelihood of good decisions, one must consider all available evidence. And in some sense, this spans all aspects of evidence generation, summarization, and consumption for decision making. So when it comes to evidence generation, it is immediate that we need to pay attention to what is the most relevant evidence to generate. But for evidence synthesis, in this spectrum, I refer to meta-analysis. For evidence contextualization, I refer to mathematical modeling, and for decision-making, I refer to various decision-making processes. So the context of this talk is about how evidence synthesis links to decision-making processes, and I'm going to make some more or less philosophical statements that I think are coming in direct conflict with a lot of the things that we traditionally do in systematic review and meta-analysis. So in general, let me offer the following observations: that we have at least three different flavors of evidence synthesis. The most common things that we do in evidence synthesis, and all the stuff that is done by Cochrane, by the EPC program, by all these entities that do systematic reviews, is foremost to describe an existing evidence base. A second role for evidence synthesis is to make predictions, and there exist several versions of tools out there that try to predict what the impact of an intervention would be in a particular patient. For example, Adjuvant Online is a tool that has been around for many, many years, and it helps clinicians create chemotherapy regimens for patients who they have in front of them. And these predictions are based essentially on systematic reviews and meta-analysis of the literature. And the last flavor of evidence synthesis would be an evidence synthesis that is geared directly to inform decision-making. And this is the thing that I would like to describe today. And essentially, I'm going to focus on an example where we have great differences between evidence synthesis for describing the evidence base and evidence synthesis that is used to inform decision making. So this is going to be a niche topic that I'm going to expand a bit on, but it is an example of a more general set of differences between these roles of evidence synthesis, and therefore I ask you to just follow the logic in this particular example, and then I will, if time allows, try to make a generalization. So the simple question that I would like to pose is, which quantities from a meta-analysis should we use to inform our decision making? And I argue that against what is the common practice, one should not be using the meta-analysis means, the random effects meta-analysis means for informing decision making, and that different statistics from a meta-analysis should be used. In some sense, I'm fixing ideas by considering a quantitative example, but the same concepts pertain to any evidence synthesis, whether it is quantitative or whether it is qualitative. So in this example that I'm going to walk you through, I'm asking the question of estimating the sensitivity and specificity of a test in a setting of interest to inform a particular decision analysis. So the example that I'm selecting is the following, is whether one could or should use positron emission tomography or its combination with computed tomography versus conventional workup for women who have breast cancer, who have a history of breast cancer, and who at some point during their surveillance developed symptoms. So such women who develop symptoms would have to be further diagnosed, and we can consider the simplified case where they have three options: either to use a conventional workup, which, depending on the symptoms and the presenting clinical situation, it may be doing X-rays or doing computed tomography and magnetic resonance imaging to image various tissues, ultrasound to image the liver, bone scintigraphy to see if there's metastasis in bones, and so on. But at the same time, there are newer technologies like this whole body positron emission tomography that can do a whole body imaging, and perhaps it can be combined with CT. So the question is, for these types of women who need to be further diagnosed, what should we do? What should we pick as a technology for their further management? So this is essentially a decisional problem, and an abstraction of the decisional problem is described here. Whenever you have a decision, whenever you are facing such a situation, you are asked to choose from a set of acts. These are the alternatives that we have to choose from. You're going to use facts and values. The facts are known data, known information about the objective reality, about how nature works, and values pertain to preferences that we have, and these are available to us through various sources. There's going to be a model, a mathematical model that maps the facts and the values to a decision-relevant quantity. And based on that decision-relevant quantity, we are going to make our decision. We are going to use a decision rule that defines, in some sense, which of the acts is optimal. So we're going to, often we use an expectation that says average over all the facts and all the values of the model for each one of the acts that we have available, and then pick the act in the set of available acts that maximizes this expectation, that maximizes this averaging. In this particular example, the set of acts are PET, CT, PET, and conventional workup, and there are many values that are included. There are many inputs in the facts and values, but in particular, I'm going to focus on the sensitivity and specificity of the tests. There's going to be a very simple model that I describe that connects the inputs to outputs. The outputs are quality-adjusted life years for women who choose the three options, and then in the end, we are going to use a decision rule that defines what is the optimal strategy. And it's the sensitivity and specificity of tests that are the inputs to this decision analysis, to this decision model, that I'm interested to obtain. And I could obtain this data perhaps by going to the literature, because if I have this data, then I can put this information into a decision model and estimate what is going to be the average expected quality-adjusted life expectancy for the patients who are treated with each one of the three management strategies. As I'm saying, the key point here for us is to estimate the sensitivity or the true positive rate, and the specificity, or 1 minus the false positive rate of each one of the 3 tests. Because if we have this, then we can get a decision-relevant quantity, which would be the quality-adjusted life years. And the strategy that yields most quality-adjusted life years is going to be the strategy that is more preferable. So obtaining estimates for test performance can be informed by an evidence synthesis of studies that already exist if the decisional setting that we deal with is similar to the settings of those studies. And this is the similar to proposition is the one that I would like to delve a bit into with some more detail. So how do I get evidence for the sensitivity and specificity of these tests? Well, I could go to the literature and do a systematic review and meta-analysis. And in this particular case, we have 5 studies on PET-CT, 13 on PET, and 11 studies on conventional workup that give us the cross-classification between the test results and the true disease status. And if I have this information, I can do a meta-analysis of sensitivity and specificity. And with a meta-analysis, I would be getting my meta-analysis means that summarize these 5, 13, and 11 studies, as you see in this table. And what people usually do and what people usually say is that you should be using these summaries to inform your decision-making. And we will argue now that this is problematic. How does a meta-analysis, a random effects meta-analysis model work? Well, it has 2 parts. It has an observational model whose role is to describe how the observations, how the observed data, which is this vector little x from the ith study, connect to the true effects, to the true sensitivity and specificity here of the population that was used in this study. And this observational model connects observation to latent quantities, to the true effects that we have in each one of these studies. It is then a structural model that describes how the true effects within each one of these studies relates across studies, so how they are distributed across studies. And the meta-analysis, the goal of the meta-analysis is to estimate this mean vector delta and this between study heterogeneity parameter, because we have a bivariate problem. We have 2 quantities, and we have, instead of a single heterogeneity parameter, we have a 2x2 matrix of variances and covariances at the between study level. So the idea is that if I am going to justify using an evidence synthesis to inform estimates for a decisional setting, I have to assume that my decisional setting is similar to the settings of the collection of studies that I had and I put in my evidence synthesis. And what does this mean? It means that if my decisional setting is exactly the same as the setting in one single index study, then what I should be doing is I should be using this estimate of the true effect in the individual study to inform my decision analysis. And we have a name for this. We call it the posterior shrunken estimate of the ith study. It's not purely the results of the ith study, which is the xi here, but it is the results of the ith study as seen in the light of all studies and in the meta-analysis model. So it is a compromise between the meta-analysis mean and the studies observed result, ignoring everything else. If my decisional setting is not exactly the same as that of a particular study, but it is simply considered as similar or as dissimilar with any other study in this collection, then what I should be doing is I should be saying that the effects that I'm after are simply exchangeable with the other studies, and they can be obtained from this distribution. And we have a name for this, and we call it the predictive distribution of a new setting. I'm rushing through these ideas, but the main point is that for my decision analysis to inform how to treat these women, I should be obtaining this posterior estimate from a particular study, if such a study exists that is most similar to my decisional setting, or I should be getting a prediction for how the treatment effects would look like in such a study, given all the other studies and all the other and the meta-analysis, if I only assume that my decisional setting is just similar to all the other studies that exist in the meta-analysis. The point is that the meta-analysis summary is not characterizing a single setting, is not characterizing the decisional setting, and therefore it's not the quantity to use in a decision analysis. Does it matter what quantity I use in my decision analysis? Yes, it does quite a bit. This is a result of an analysis that says what would the quality adjusted life years on average be with PET-CT, PET, or conventional workup if you were to assume that your decisional setting was exactly equal to the decisional setting of the first, second, fifth, etc. study with PET-CT, and similarly for the other PET and conventional workup. And what you can see is that the estimate here is the estimate of the QALYs that we would get if we use the posterior shrunken estimate of the first study, the second study, and so on. If we were to use the meta-analysis mean, we would get these tight confidence credible intervals and that diamond. And if we were to say that our decisional setting is unlike any of the decisional settings in these studies, and we just want to assume that it's going to be similar to the studies that we have in front of us, then we would take the predictive distribution of these of these meta-analyses. That would be this white diamond and these longer, wider confidence intervals. And depending on what the actual framing of the decisional problem is, you would pick either you would have to be picking something that is an empty symbol and not the filled symbol, which means either an existing study or a predictive distribution from the meta-analysis. The idea that I am putting forward here is that the way that we use an evidence synthesis to inform a decision analysis is going to be very different than the way that we present an evidence synthesis or a meta-analysis in our usual discussions. And the role of the evidence synthesis is to first learn an evidence synthesis model that describes the relationships between study characteristics and bias-free study estimates, and then use this evidence synthesis model to predict the value of the parameter of interest in the context of a decision model. And this essentially means that in the most general case, we have various studies that pertain to different contexts. They observe data, and from these data deviate from what the studies estimate, and because of bias, what the studies estimate deviates from what the studies wanted to estimate. And in our decision analysis, in our evidence synthesis for decision analysis, what we want to do is we want to learn a model that learns the true study estimates, meaning the bias-corrected true study estimates, given all the data that we have about the contexts, given the observed data, and given the analysts' opinions about how big the biases between observed and desired estimates in each study are. And when you have this model, you're using it to actually predict what the treatment effect would be in the decisional setting for your decisional problem. And here I use this slide from a book that is on cost effectiveness analysis and essentially describes how I would be getting the effects that I need to plug into a cost effectiveness analysis. So these ideas have shaped the recommendations for evidence synthesis that are found in the second panel for the cost effectiveness analysis in health and medicine, of which I was a member, and the recommendations of the panel essentially say that evidence synthesis for informing decision making versus for typical evidence synthesis for summarizing evidence differ in many important dimensions, and there are differences in how comprehensive you are allowed to be. There are differences in the goal of the evidence synthesis, in your willingness to learn across designs. So usually, for example, when describing evidence, we do not make synthesis across randomized and non-randomized studies, but we should be doing that when we are going to be informing decision-making. The need to grade strength of evidence, our statistical modeling choices, and whether we prime transparency versus objectivity. There are more things that I was going to mention, but I think that I will stop here. I apologize for the rough exposition. I tried to make things a bit shorter.